Hey you guys, this particular video is going to address, it's going to be a case study, and we're going to examine whether Darwin's theses are as rock solid as claimed by the scientific establishment. So I bring this up to you because when you guys go to college, I would say if you go to a Catholic college, you go to a Christian college, probably most Christian colleges, and certainly secular. If you take any biology courses or psychology courses, they're going to be touting Darwin's theory, and they are going to be claiming that it is established fact and it is not something to be questioned. And I have to add to this that I was a Darwinist for 20 years, and I had always kind of held Darwin's theory a little bit loosely. I had assumed it was true because so many in the scientific establishment believe it after all. There must be some legitimacy to it. And I examined Darwin's claims from a molecular standpoint, and because it is on the basis of molecules that evolution acts. And I did not see molecular evidence for evolution or for origin of life, but I was a hopeful Darwinist for 2 decades. I thought, well, they just haven't really uncovered that secret yet, but give them time and they will uncover that secret. Well, they never, in fact, uncovered that secret, and it is doubtful whether they actually ever will. So know that I am coming at this not as a religious fundamentalist, which there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. I'm coming at this as someone who was a Darwinist. So let's examine Darwin's theses. So he had a couple of them. So I just want to tell you right off the bat that Darwin did not employ the scientific method when he collected his data. Now, it does not mean that he was not a good researcher. He actually was an excellent and fastidious researcher. He was really a remarkable man. Darwin employed a very legitimate method of inquiry. Now, I want to add, again, not the scientific method, but it was still legitimate. And it was a method of inquiry used by researchers in the historical sciences of geology, paleontology, and archaeology. I actually meant to correct that misspelling on that slide. I am a disgrace. But yeah, it's a very legitimate method of inquiry that he used, and it is this. He inferred past causes from present observed effects. Okay? And there's nothing wrong with using this as a method of inquiry. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. So an example of this in use would be determining the cause of an ash layer in the earth. So you're a geologist and you stick a probe down and you go down so many meters and you find this ash layer. And you are sitting there saying, wow, what was the cause of the ash layer? Was it a typhoon? Was it an earthquake? What was it? Well, since volcanoes, we know today that a present cause, since volcanoes are presently known to emit ash when they erupt, one could infer that a volcano from the past was the cause of the ash layer, not an earthquake or a typhoon or any other thing, or a flood. Okay, we would say, okay, this volcano deposited this ash layer. There's nothing wrong with this method of inquiry. I mean, you can't run a scientific experiment to know that. You make observations, but you can't really do an experiment to see if that is true. So you infer a presently known cause to a past occurrence. Nothing wrong with that. And where did he probably learn this methodology? Well, probably from Charles Lyell, who was an influential 19th century historical scientist, and he greatly influenced Charles Darwin. And while he was on the voyage of the HMS Beagle, and guys, I'm sorry I did not italicize HMS Beagle. I should have fixed these slides before. And I had the chance to, but I just forgot to do it. But while on the voyage of that HMS Beagle to the Galapagos Islands, Darwin read Lyell's magnum opus, The Principles of Geology. Again, this is a historical science. So Lyell is going to be using this idea of inferring present causes to past known events. Nothing wrong with that. So Darwin is on the island of the Galapagos, and he's collecting tons of data. His notebooks were packed with his observations. He did his homework here. And so what Darwin recognized, he recognized that animals share many common features. And these common features are called homologs. And a homolog could be a pentadactyl limb, like a 5-digit limb. It could be a placenta, or it could be a uterus that's inside the body of an animal. It could be hair is a homolog. We could say that a tail is a homolog, or incisors. So he said that he reasoned that nearly all organisms that have these homologs, they must share a common ancestor. So he might have looked at all the mammals and said, oh, all these mammals give birth to live young, and these mammals all have hair, and these mammals all have mammary glands by which they feed their young. So it must be, if we could roll back the times, the hands of the clock, and go back, millions upon millions of years, then we probably would have seen an organism that would have given rise to a single organism, a single ancestor that would have given rise, to these very diverse animals today. So he would say that, a dog and a cat share some common ancestor back in geological time. So he proposed that descent with modification, and this was his thing, descent with modification was the presently acting cause for biological novelty. Now, what is descent with modification? You can imagine, and this probably happened with the birds. He observed these finches. You hear the anecdotes about Darwin's finches. And what Darwin noticed was that these finches on these different islands, that they looked almost exactly the same, except their beaks were different. So what he reasoned, and I don't think that this is I think this actually was probably true with the finches. All these finches probably had a common ancestor. That is probably very true. And what would possibly happen is, let's say that you were on an island where the predominant food supply for the bird is seeds. Or let's say it's bugs. And then, so these finches, all like a whole bunch of finches, get caught up in a storm and they get blown to a different island. And on this different island, there's not as many bugs, but there's more seeds. Well, you can imagine that the individual variations in the beak shape and size, that for those finches that had beaks that could better exploit the seeds, the food supply of the seeds, that they would have more offspring. So their offspring then would have that beak that is better fashioned to eat seeds. So I don't think that this at all is a leap of any kind that is not correct. Probably this is exactly true. But again, we're looking at finches, at different beaks in finches. We're not looking at the difference between, a fish and an amphibian. And that's what he reasoned. He reasoned that we actually saw these huge jumps in evolution in these features. So here's something interesting, though. His findings, this descent with modification, which really demanded what would be called gradualism. So we would see over the course of geological time these really gradual changes in these organisms. Well, there was absolutely no support from the known fossil record at that time. Absolutely no support. So it's interesting that Darwin went ahead and he formulated this very complicated theory. And he probably was somewhat aware of the fossil record. He should have been at the time. And everything that he said absolutely contradicted the fossil record. So this is where he was not acting like a scientist. He was not making observations of what we currently knew about organisms at the time, ancient organisms. So there was no evidence of the gradualism that Darwinian processes demanded in the known fossil record at the writing of Origin of Species in 1859. So here's something kind of interesting. So Darwin's book was really not gaining a whole lot of traction initially, and so he needed to get some pretty brilliant people to endorse it. So he sends a manuscript over to Louis Agassiz, who was a Harvard professor, who was a world-renowned expert on the fossil record. And Agassiz had credentials that were much, much greater than Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin had an MA, while Agassiz had an MD and a PhD. So Agassiz, having earned a PhD and medical degrees from Erlangen and Munich, on top of this, he studied with French naturalist Georges Cuvier. And Georges Cuvier is credited as the founding father of paleontology. So there was no more highly credentialed person than Agassiz who could actually speak on the veracity of the claims that Darwin had in his manuscript. So add to these credentials for Agassiz, he also went on to head Harvard's Lawrence Scientific School, and he founded its Museum of Comparative Zoology. So Agassiz was literally a world-renowned expert on the fossil record. So Agassiz concluded that the record of the explosion of Cambrian life posed an insuperable or insurmountable difficulty for Darwin's theory. He said that given the fact, and if you guys aren't familiar with the Cambrian explosion and the fossil record, what the Cambrian explosion showed was that when you look at the geological layers of fossils, we don't see any gradualism. We see where it's almost like these animals all of a sudden miraculously populated the earth. And we don't see any of these ancestors that led up to these animals. They just instantly populated the earth. And even I think Richard Dawkins, atheist Richard Dawkins, he made a comment that it's almost like the organisms miraculously were just put there. And, you know, for those of us who do embrace a creation model for the universe, we say absolutely God created these organisms. God loves life. And what God has done in every stage of creating life was he populated it. He populated the earth with he packed it with as much life as the earth could sustain. You know, we have a very creative God, and he loves life. He loves body plans. He loves animal complexity. And the fossil record showed exactly that. These animals just, boom, they just showed up. And the Cambrian explosion is called an explosion because we saw literally an explosion of animal and plant diversity. Seemingly came from nowhere. And so Agassiz absolutely rejected Darwin's hypothesis. And he was not alone in this. Darwin sends the manuscript to Roderick Impey Murchison, who was also an expert in the Cambrian fossil record. And Murchison said this. He says, the earliest signs of living things announcing as they do a high complexity of organization because of this, because they announce immediately, as soon as you see them in the rock layers, they really demonstrate a high complexity of organization from the get-go, entirely exclude the hypothesis of a transmutation from lower to higher grades of being. Now, the transmutation from lower to higher grades of being, that was Darwin's theory. It was gradualism, that these organisms incrementally, taking baby step by baby step by baby step, they acquired these new features. And Murchison is saying that's not what the fossil record showed, not at all. So he was in agreement with Agassiz. So the rebukes on Darwin's conclusions from his contemporaries don't stop with these two men. We then have Adam Sedgwick, who was a professor of botany and geology at Cambridge University. So this guy, he was not a slouch either. And he also thought that Darwin had leaped beyond the evidence. As he penned in a letter in 1859, he says, you have deserted, after a start on that tram road of all solid physical truth, the true method of induction. This was a scathing rebuke. Darwin had accompanied Sedgwick on the HMS Beagle voyage to the Galapagos Islands in 1831. And so, because I was a past Darwinist, I did not believe these claims that Sedgwick actually had traveled with Darwin. Of course, I'm just skeptical because that inner Darwinist in me still tries to linger. So I looked up online to see the correspondence between Darwin and Sedgwick, and it is all documented. And I was really surprised to read letters that Sedgwick wrote. They had correspondence that went just back and forth. And in one of the letters, Sedgwick said, when I read your manuscript, he said, there were times that I laughed so hard that my sides ached. And he said, there were other times that I cried. And he said he laughed so hard because the claims that Darwin made were so inane and they so contradicted what they knew about the fossil record at the time. And then he cried because Darwin did desert the true method of induction. And he, in essence, was saying, what happened to you? You are no longer acting like a scientist when you draw conclusions like this. So I bring this to your attention because these well-credentialed historical scientists all concluded that Darwin's explanations as to the origin of species did not represent the best inference to the history of life from what were known at the time contemporary causes. So they said, Darwin, you may have used the present inferences for past occurrences, but they said your interpretations were all completely wrong. Now, what's interesting is that Darwinism didn't just face problems with these guys early on, but it has all along, if you look at the history of science from 1859 to present, we see that Darwinism has consistently been on life support because they just can't find a mechanical basis for its processes. They've tried to replicate this, with origin of the first cells. They've tried to replicate this. Breathlessly, you'll see a headline that will say, Craig Ventnor, he was a scientist who did this. He created the first cell. And so, the Christians all run, they tuck tail and run. Oh no, evolution is true. The creation account is false. But if you actually read what Craig Ventnor did in his lab, he took an already existing cell. And so he used already manufactured parts. He did not create a cell from scratch. They can't even do it with a single cell because cells are too complex. So it's just kind of interesting. And I hope you guys are asking, then why does Darwinism still have such a hold today? Well, when we had the Enlightenment period, the Enlightenment brought a lot of philosophers who were humanists, and they wanted to remove God as part of the equation in epistemological methods, in understanding why the natural world is as it is, in philosophical arguments. They wanted to remove God altogether and place man front and center. And for too many scientists who had occupied chairs of the Royal Society, early in its days, probably until the early 1800s, about 99% of the scientists who were at the Royal Society were Christians. They were either Puritans, Reformed, Catholic, or Anglicans. There were no atheists that were doing science. Well, you have the Enlightenment period come along, and they're trying to get God out of all of this, and the French Revolution that happened in the latter part of the 1700s, which really was Enlightenment thinking carried to new heights. This was about 65 years before Darwin had published, and there was just really a move to desperately remove God as the source of the origins of life. And so there was an agenda. I'm just going to say, I guess you can call me a conspiratorial thinker, but there was an agenda. How else can you explain how top leading scientists absolutely shot this theory down? These were world-renowned scientists, shot the theory down, but the theory still gained incredible traction. So it was because people wanted to believe that. So, again, we look at this. This was really, I guess I would call it a bastardization of science. It was absolutely not scientific in the least. So all the more reason why it becomes really important that all of us become well versed in interpreting data well, and we don't let the idols of the mind, there's 4 of them that Francis Bacon identified, we be really careful that we don't allow the idols that are within our minds to actually color our interpretation of results and data. So that is about all I have to say. So yeah, these were some questions I had for you to think about. So let me actually move forward to this. So I actually got a lot of this information from these two books here. And the nice thing about both of these books is they are heavily footnoted, and they actually cite original papers where a lot of the research was done. And don't think that I did not look up the skeptic in me did not look up and actually hunt down those original papers. But anyway, thanks you guys for listening, and I will see you guys in class.